Completely agree with you. And this is why one of the reasons we have been asking for is that, this military solution really is not the answer to this. The fact that we have these massive daisy cutters and massive bombs and things like that, that's not really the solution. For several years we have been asking that you need to start looking at political strategies. We need to start looking at this in the broad strategic context. Militarily we're fine, but at the same time in Afghanistan, the more individuals you kill, the more environments that you do not understand and offend people, it's having consequences. Recruitment is going up, and at the same time, you're having individuals that are joining the opposition. So political strategies obviously are something that we should have looked at in the past, but at least we're looking at them now.
Audrey, of the 6 different exits or exit strategies for terrorism, you mentioned decapitation rarely succeeds. Another 1 or 2. What is the most probable outcome?
With respect to any group or with respect to Al-Qaeda?
With respect to your entire sample.
The most probable outcome is probably failure, because most groups have a difficult time continuing on for various reasons. The loss of popular support, and this infighting and factionalization. And one of the most classic ways for groups to end, and this happens very regularly, is through mistargeting, through targeting an element of the potential audience that they're trying to reach. I mean, one of the things that ties in with what Hekmat was just saying is that we have a tendency to think of terrorism and counterterrorism as being a kind of a dichotomous 2-part relationship. But really, I think it's useful to think of it in terms of a triangle, where at the top of the triangle is the audiences. And so, things that you can do in that 2-part relationship may backfire with respect to the particular audience at which your tool is being aimed. I mean, that relates both to the groups and also to those who are engaged in the use of military or other types of tactics. If you're trying to reach the population within Afghanistan, then there are certain things that might work or not work with that 2-part relationship. If you're trying to reach the American public, again, you have slightly different things involved. If you're Al-Qaeda and you're trying to reach potential recruits, again, it's that other side of the triangle. So we have a tendency to think of these strategies as being a little bit like interstate strategies, where there's a compellence involved, where the state does something and then the group does something and then there's back and forth. Whereas actually, I think there are strategies of leverage much more often, and that's one of the reasons why they tend to end in failure. That leverage of that third side can be aimed toward mobilizing support, toward polarizing the internal domestic conditions within a state, perhaps, toward provoking a state to do something that therefore serves the interests of the group. It's a much more complex calculation than we tend to think about from within state governments.
But to make it very simple, if there is a policy recommendation coming out of what you just said, it would be allow them to make mistakes and exploit their mistakes.
That is an important part of it, but that's not the same really as saying that you can sit back and just allow everything to, you just don't do anything. I mean, that's certainly not the case, because right now, particularly if you use an individual case like Al-Qaeda, and by that I mean Al-Qaeda's core, I think Al-Qaeda is either going to implode in this way, especially assuming that we don't make mistakes that prevent that implosion, or it's going to reorient in a way that it is able to draw more affiliates in a kind of a more conventional kind of use of force. And those who talk about global insurgency, I think, are actually, in my personal opinion, speaking in counterproductive terms, because global insurgency is a more legitimate kind of violence than is terrorism. But in any case, those are the 2 pathways that we can go down, and a lot depends upon the degree to which we encourage the infighting and factionalization between the different members of the core, and then the differences between the core and the affiliates, versus the degree to which we drive them in a more traditional military way.
Thank you. Let me, before I open to the audience, because I know a lot of people have questions for you, let me ask Shiraz, because we have 2 people here that have an experience with Afghanistan. Do you think that the conditions in Western countries, for young Muslims in Western countries such as the US or the UK, are fundamentally different, and that the sort of things that you need to do in order to get people out of extremism, out of violent extremism in particular, are perhaps slightly different than in places like Afghanistan?
I think so. I mean, the sort of whole social dynamics are very different. and the level of interventions that you could raise in the West, for example, wouldn't necessarily apply to a young 20-something in Pakistan, for example. So I think that there's certainly a difference in approach and access, I suppose, to get at some of these guys. Having said that, of course, there are very basic similarities here. There's going to be, has to be a theological component to de-radicalizing, I think, some of these guys, and to bring them out, particularly in the context of people who become terrorists and are prepared to become suicide bombers. So in that sense, there's probably a sort of unified core idea that you could seek to replicate. But at its core, I think we have far more opportunity in the West. And as we've seen what's been happening in the UK, particularly since 2007 with lots of defections and people like Noman Ben Othman, myself, Abdullah Anas, just various people going to the community and being able to raise a debate in Britain. It's really created a sort of change that I didn't see coming in 2005, 2006. It's not to say we've made great progress in Britain or that the landscape has radically changed, but certainly the sort of seeds of change are there, and I think that's happening in a way that you don't see elsewhere.
Shiraz, you've obviously become a very prominent writer and researcher about this subject, and we're actually glad that you will be joining us. But I wanted to ask you, since we're here in New York and since the United States is starting to develop a countering violent extremism strategy, this sort of policy has been in place in Britain for quite a number of years. If you had to single out two pieces of advice for American policymakers in this room, what should they copy and what must they not copy from the British example?
Okay, the British example, I think, is just predicated, unfortunately, however well-intentioned, it's just predicated on a system in a way that it can't achieve its objectives. Fundamentally, there is a belief within Britain amongst the practitioners at the highest levels of Prevent that you can co-opt, and indeed should co-opt, and use non-violent radicals in essence to take angry young men and to allow them to dissipate their energies in a radical fashion, but albeit one that is not violent. So examples would be groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that's very unfortunate because there is an obsession almost with looking only at violent extremism, not at extremism per se. And I think that denies the relationship between extremist organizations and their violent cousins. No terrorist organization exists in a vacuum. They all require a much broader social and cultural movement that creates narratives and explains and moralizes and justifies their acts of terror. They need the cheerleaders who glorify them and remember them and who elevate them. And that's precisely the kind of support and ideological succor.
That's what they must not do. Now let's be positive. What should they copy?
What should they copy? I think they should, not copy, but what they should implement, because we're not doing it ourselves in Britain. What they should do is adopt a far more robust values-led narrative, a values-led approach based around the core, non-negotiable, normative values of US society, of British society, and seek to empower groups and individuals who subscribe to those beliefs. That's not to say criminalize those who don't believe in your values, but it's to say, and I think the state has a legitimate right to say, if you don't sign up to and subscribe to our values, the state will not elevate you and engage with you. And that's well within its rights to do that.